today I can confirm that the UK is donating Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. Storm Shadow is a long-range, conventional-only precision strike capability. It complements the long-range systems already gifted, including HIMARS and Harpoon missiles, as well as Ukraine's own Neptune cruise missile and longer-range missions elsewhere gifted. The donation of these weapon systems gives Ukraine the best chance to defend themselves against Russia's continued brutality, especially the deliberate targeting of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, which is against international law. Ukraine has a right to be able to defend itself against this. The use of Storm Shadow will allow Ukraine to push back Russian forces based within Ukrainian sovereign territory. I'm sure the House will understand that I'm not going into further details of the capabilities, but while these weapons will give Ukraine new capability, members should recognise that these systems are not even in the same league as the Russian AS-24 Killjoy hypersonic missile or Shahed Iranian one-way drones, or even the Calibrated cruise missile with a range of over 2,000 kilometres. We are now on day 442 of the conflict. During the period, Moscow has, according to the United Nations, provoked the largest displacement of people in Europe since World War II, including almost 8 million refugees and almost 6 million internally forced from their homes. We must not lose sight of these staggering statistics, but worse still, Russia's battlefield setbacks have led it to cynically targeting energy infrastructure, putting millions of people at risk of sickness and death in cold, unsanitary conditions. Take, for example, the besieged city of Bakhmut, where there are no fewer than 7,000 residents, 1/10 of the original population, who for the last 9 months have been hiding in basements without clean water, electricity or gas, and minimal connection to the outside world. From the scale of Russia's attacks, it is clear that they have not limited themselves to military targets. Their purpose is simply to terrorise the local population into submission. That conclusion is the only one that can be drawn when you look at Russia's ever-expanding charge sheet of international humanitarian law violations. As of the 2nd of April, there have been 788 attacks on healthcare facilities, hospitals, clinics, medical centres. There have been instances of damages to educational facilities, schools, daycare centres, and even nurseries. Meanwhile, Russia has plundered crops and agricultural equipment on an industrial scale, destroying grain storage and handling facilities. According to estimates from the Kyiv School of Economics, Russia stole or destroyed 4.04 million tonnes of grain and oilseeds, valued at $1.9 billion, in Ukrainian territories during the 2022 season alone. And the Kremlin's continued intransigence is contributing to the current backlog of grain exports. Besides this, Russia has bombed industrial facilities, including the Azot chemical plant, risking toxic industrial chemical release and environmental impact. It has attacked Ukraine's largest refinery at Kremchuk on at least 3 occasions. It has bombed airfields, ports, roads and railway networks, preventing refugees from fleeing the danger. It has taken out communication networks affecting banks, internet and cell phones, with residents in some areas now forced to barter for food. And Kremlin strikes on substations, power plants and power lines have impacted water treatment facilities, leaving cities like Mariupol without water and reliant on delivery bottled supplies. At the same time, Russia has forcibly occupied and undermined the safe operation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe. As Rafael Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, has said, every single one of the IAEA's crucial 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety and security in an armed conflict has been compromised. He recently warned the situation around the plant was potentially dangerous. And sadly, so far, at least 23,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed or wounded, although the actual figure is likely to be substantially higher. Thousands of citizens have been sent to sinister filtration camps before being forcibly relocated to Russia. Some 6,000 children, ranging in ages from 4 months to 17 years, are now in, quote, re-education camps across Russia. The UN, as well as US investigators, have found that Russia has committed war crimes with reported evidence of executions, torture and sexual violence in civilian areas. In early April, President Zelensky said more than 70,000 Russian war crimes had been recorded since Putin's invasion. the names of Bucha and Izium have been synonymous with mass murder. The world will not forget the bombing of the drama theatre in Mariupol, where 1,200 civilians sought shelter under a giant sign reading "Children." No matter how much Russia tries to hide and bulldoze over the scene, we will not forget. Even in the territories Russia has illegally annexed, citizens find themselves subjected to excesses, the worst excesses of totalitarianism. A Russian passport is increasingly essential to access vital services, a nightmare for those with newborn babies. Civilian infrastructure, such as healthcare facilities, are being seized and repurposed to treat wounded servicemen. Kill lists of civic leaders have been drawn up, citizens executed in cold blood, and concerted attempts made to erase Ukrainian culture, history, and identity. Mr. Speaker, we should be clear, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the targeting of civilians and infrastructure essential to the civilian population of Ukraine has not happened by accident in the fog of war. Much of it was planned Russian policy. Russia has fallen. We've seen that handiwork in Syria. In March, President Putin himself was indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. But we should also be clear, as numerous credible reports indicate, Russia's morally bankrupt approach might have been made in the Kremlin, but is often carried out willingly, not just by rogue units, but by the ordinary rank and file across Russian armed forces. An even clearer picture of Russia's barbaric approach emerges when we look at some of the weapons they are using against innocent civilians. I'm not referring here to the extensive strikes against Ukraine's electric power network from cruise and surface-to-surface missiles, or even the use of short-range ballistic missiles like the Iskander, which infamously hit the train station in Kramatorsk, killing 60 and wounding more than 110, or even the use of 2 500-kilogram bombs dropped by Russian fighter aircraft on that theatre in Mariupol. The fact is, Russia has used cluster munitions with wholesale regard for human life and civilians. They have been dropped near a hospital in Valuda, a 9M79 series Tokcha ballistic missile delivering a 9 N123 cluster munition warhead killed 4 civilians and injured 10, including 6 healthcare workers. It has used Smerch cluster munition rockets in 3 neighbourhoods in Kyiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, resulting in reports of 9 civilian deaths and 37 injuries, according to the United Nations. Russia also relies on mass fires. Indiscriminate artillery bombardment to built-up areas account for the vast majority of civilian casualties, injured or killed. And Moscow makes extensive use of conventional anti-personnel mines and improvised booby traps to indiscriminately harm civilians. Dead bodies, the homes and vehicles of Ukrainian civilians, and even children's toys have been rigged as lethal devices. Russia has laid mines remotely and mechanically, covering significant areas of farmland with scant evidence of either marking minefields or warning civilians about their presence. These minefields will leave a legacy long after the conflict ends. Russia has used hundreds of Iranian-made Shahid drones to attack targets in Ukraine. Loitering munitions sent on numerous suicide missions have repeatedly taken their toll on civilians. Last week, these weapons struck a university campus in Odessa, and once more, civilians were in the crosshairs in Kyiv. Mr. Speaker, from the start, I've been clear that our support for Ukraine is responsible, calibrated, coordinated, and agile, aligned and united with the international community. We are helping the Ukrainians defend their homeland. Most importantly, it is responsive to Russia's own actions. None of this would have been necessary had Russia not invaded. But now it is about pushing back their forces and deterring them from committing yet more crimes by holding the Russian military establishment to account for their actions. In December, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wrote to Russian Defence Minister Shoigu and set out the UK government's objection to the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, and that further attacks, contrary to international humanitarian law, for example, the principle of distinction codified in Articles 48, 51 and 52 of the Additional Protocol to the Geneva Conventions, would force me to consider donating more capable weapons to Ukraine so they may better defend themselves within their territory. Unfortunately, Russia has continued down this dark path. This year, Russia's leadership has continued to systematically target civilians and civilian infrastructure with bombs, missiles and drones. More medical facilities were targeted in January than the previous 6 months combined. It has bombed power facilities in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Lviv, Zaporizhzhia, Odessa and Odessa Oblast. Incidents of civilian casualties have increased, in especially areas close to the front lines such as Kherson and Bakhmut. In January, a block of flats in Dnieper was wiped out by a 5.5-ton Russian kitchen missile, probably causing 124 casualties, including 45 fatalities. In March, a 5-story apartment block in Zaporizhia was attacked with an S-300 missile, almost completely destroying the building. And between April the 27th and May, Russian forces conducted strikes against Ukraine using Kh-101 and Kh-55 long-range air-launched cruise missile. Despite Kremlin claims that it is targeting Ukraine's military industrial facilities, one of the buildings struck was a 9-story apartment building. The salvo left 23 dead and dozens more injured. Last week, Russia's shelling struck residential buildings, and on Monday they bombed a Red Cross warehouse full of humanitarian aid. And drone footage from Bakhmut appears to show white phosphorus raining down on the city ablaze. The use of such incendiary weapons, which burn at 800 degrees Celsius, with concentrations of civilians, is a contravention of Protocol 3 of the Convention of Certain Conventional Weapons. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I've said many times in the past, we simply will not stand by while Russia kills civilians. We have seen what Ukrainians can do when they have the right capabilities. In recent days, 30 Shahed drones have been shot down. The Ukrainian Air Force says 23 out of 25 cruise missiles fired from sea and land have been downed. And we have had confirmation that Lieutenant General Oshchuk, the Ukrainian Air Force commander, that even Russia's much vaunted Killjoy air-launched hypersonic missile has been brought down. And that is why, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister and I have now taken the decision to provide longer-range capabilities. In December, I informed the House that I was developing options to respond to Russia's continued aggression in a calibrated and determined manner. Today, I can confirm that the UK is donating Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. Storm Shadow is a long-range, conventional-only precision strike capability. It complements the long-range systems already gifted, including HIMARS and Harpoon missiles, as well as Ukraine's own Neptune cruise missile and longer-range missions elsewhere gifted. The donation of these weapon systems gives Ukraine the best chance to defend themselves against Russia's continued brutality, especially the deliberate targeting of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, which is against international law. Ukraine has a right to be able to defend itself against this. The use of Storm Shadow will allow Ukraine to push back Russian forces based within Ukrainian sovereign territory. I'm sure the House will understand that I'm not going into further details of the capabilities, but while these weapons will give Ukraine new capability, members should recognise that these systems are not even in the same league as the Russian AS-24 Killjoy hypersonic missile or Shahed Iranian one-way attack drones, or even the Calibrated cruise missile with a range of over 2,000 kilometres, roughly 7 times that of a Storm Shadow missile. Russia must recognise that their actions alone have led to such systems being provided to Ukraine. It is my judgment as the Defence Secretary that this is a calibrated and proportionate response to Russia's escalations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, travelling through that country, as I have done several times since the invasion, you see the smashed buildings and the piles of rubble where once there were thriving businesses and homes full of life. They reveal the truth of Russia's invasion, their needless destruction and their gratuitous violence, their continuing violations despite warnings of international law and the deliberate targeting and killing of civilians. They are the visible and tragic symbols of the Kremlin's desperation. Try as they might, the Kremlin cannot hide the fact that their invasion is already failing. They can only occupy the rubble left by their destruction. At this week's Victory Day parade all it did was showcase this historic failure. It demonstrated Putin's efforts to twist the Soviet Union's sacrifice against the Nazis was an insult to their own immortal regiment. It was the facade of power, a distraction from the faltering invasion, the appeal to unity while even Russia's own leadership loses confidence, the hypocrisy of claiming victimhood while waging a war of their own choosing. The reality is, this is the war of President Putin's own choosing, at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty and its civilian lives. Mr. Speaker, as you know, the UK stands for values of freedom, the rule of law, human rights and the protection of civilians. We will stand side by side with Ukraine. We will continue to support them in defence of their sovereign country. I commend this statement to the House.
Ron Healy.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are united in our determination to help in the defence of Ukraine and of our shared values. And I welcome the Defence Secretary's statement, his first statement to the House on Ukraine since January, the first announcement of new weapons to Ukraine since February. We welcome this vital new military support as the Ukrainians prepare for their expected counter-offensive. Mr. Deputy Speaker, speaking in The Hague last week, President Zelensky said, "We're not attacking either Putin or Moscow. We're fighting on our own territory, defending our villages and towns." And today's announcement of UK Storm Shadow missiles will strengthen Ukraine's fight to repel the Russian forces and to defend against the brutal attacks the Defence Secretary has spelt out in detail today. Can I ask him, what are the limitations put on the use of these longer-range missiles? How have they been integrated with Ukrainian planes? And will other NATO allies now follow with similar support? Mr. Deputy Speaker, it was 6 months ago, as the Defence Secretary has said, when he told this House he was open-minded to sending longer-range missiles. And 3 months ago, in February, the Prime Minister said the UK will be the first country to provide Ukraine with longer-range missiles. So as I asked in my urgent question 2 weeks ago, why has this taken so long? Ukraine needs all military aid on the front line now. And President Zelensky said last night, and I quote, "Not everything has arrived yet. We're expecting armoured vehicles." So can I ask the Defence Secretary, have all the 10 types of UK armoured vehicles pledged to Ukraine now been delivered into Ukraine? And the Defence Secretary is right. Putin proclaimed in the Victory Day parade in Moscow this week, "Here is to our victory," he said, when he can't disguise and he can't distract from his failure in Ukraine. But despite this, Russia is far from a spent military force, and the next few weeks and few months will be critical. I'm really proud of British military leadership over the last year on Ukraine. I want, in 6 months' time, to be able to say the same. We want the UK's momentum for Ukraine to be maintained and accelerated. So when will we see the 2023 action plan for Ukraine, which the Defence Secretary promised last August? Why has no equipment bought by the UK-led International Fund for Ukraine been delivered to Kyiv 9 months after this scheme was set up? When will ministers designate the Wagner Group as a terrorist organisation, as Labour has argued since February with support on both sides of the House? Why is the government still refusing UK support for a special tribunal to prosecute Putin? And who in government is responsible for leading, integrating and coordinating the UK's backing for Ukraine? Now, the Defence Secretary knows that the government has had and will continue to have Labour's fullest support in military aid to Ukraine and in reinforcing NATO allies. NATO has overhauled its defences since Putin invaded Ukraine, and the Chief of the Defence Staff yesterday welcomed new NATO regional plans. Can the Defence Secretary confirm today the UK will fulfil in full our obligations in these plans? And finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the British public are still strongly behind Ukraine. They want the UK to continue our support, to confront Russian aggression and to pursue Putin for his war crimes. We must and we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his and his party's support, and he knows as much as anyone of all our determination to see this through. And I think it has been an exemplary example of Parliament at its best over this last 440 or 50 days of this Russian invasion. I will try and seek to answer many of his questions and get straight to the point. On limitations, obviously we will not in public talk about if there are any limitations. The key here is to give Ukraine that capability to defend itself. What I can say is throughout this process we always make sure we gift having examined minimising escalation and provocation unnecessarily to the Russian state. That is not the business we are in. We are in the business of helping Ukraine defend itself within its sovereign territory. And of course, it is easy to forget that, of course, none of this would be needed. No deep strike capability would be needed if Russia withdrew its forces to the other side of the border back into Russia, and every Russian force would be safe after that. But of course, that is why we are seeking deep fires within Ukraine, for example, because Russia have invaded so far deeply into another country. On integration of the plane, of Storm Shadow is an air-fired missile. He is correct. It is, of course, not easy to take a British, French missile and incorporate it on a former Soviet or a Russian aircraft. That has been one of the reasons for the time is working out if it is technically feasible, and I would like to pay tribute to our scientists and our technicians who have done an amazing job, not just with this type of capability, and actually other scientists across Europe who have managed to produce integration of Western weapons into Russian equipment, or indeed some innovative capabilities at a speed that I often question why I can't have that speed when I domestically try and commission some of those capabilities. So there are lessons there, but that is one of the areas. I'm not sure there is many other powers with similar weapon systems for similar support. There is, however, a drive by many allies to deliver further deep capability. HIMARS is obviously 80 to 90 kilometres, but also there is another American system that was gifted a few months ago, forgive me, I can't remember its name, that has a longer range. And also in the international fund, one of our requirements in the second round is deep fires, deep strike, the ability to do that as well. It took long, Mr. Deputy, partly because of the technical feasibility. Taking effectively a sort of fifth or fourth generation weapon system and putting it sometimes on second or third generation aircraft is not easy, and we will see. They are not, I'm not going to comment on when we expect these to be used, but nevertheless they have yet to be tested, and we will soon find out, or maybe in the next few weeks or months we will find out to the extent that has worked, but that takes time. Secondly, as I've always reassured the House, I wanted to calibrate our response. We need to make sure that we do these things in line that helps Ukraine further its capabilities. Gifting these earlier when we were unsure whether they necessarily work, and indeed without any form of offensive on the horizon, may not have made them vulnerable, but B, may not have made the difference that we're all trying to achieve. So all I can say now is, having technically cleared the hurdles, and as everyone talks about an expected counteroffence, now is the right time to gift these to Ukraine, and they are now going into or are in the country itself. On momentum, I would say that no one should doubt any of our momentum here. Yes, the media comes and goes and covers different aspects of the world, and Sudan comes along. But I think if you look at the government's track record in either its gifting, its training, Interflex, which we went from 9,000 last year, we're training 20,000 this year around the country in the United Kingdom, the gifting of the tanks at the beginning of the year, our momentum continues. And on that question about what has gone in the country, I'm certainly confident. I know that all our tanks have gone into the country, many of our Spartans, many of our armoured vehicles. I don't know if every single one has, and I'm happy to write to the right honourable gentleman, but the big ones, like the tanks, they are all in country. They have trained, exercised, both here but then in Ukraine. And I know that the Ukrainian forces using them so far have enjoyed them very much and talk very highly of the challenges, and that also goes to the AS-90s that have not only been put in, but I think they've also been used as well. I think there's another lesson there. They seem to get excellent availability on the AS-90, so the lessons to be learnt in our capability. On the Wagner Group designation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of course, prescribing an organisation is a matter for the Home Office, done via collective right round. I can't comment on when and how those things happen. We've obviously heard the calls from both sides of the House to prescribe it. Wagner is a thoroughly a nasty organisation, not only from what we see in Ukraine, but what we see in West Africa, and indeed we've seen in Syria, and does pose a threat to the United Kingdom and her allies, either directly or certainly indirectly, and it is a group that needs dealing with, although Mr. Prigozhin seems to be making himself deeply unpopular with the leadership in the Kremlin at the moment, and if I was him, I wouldn't stand near any open windows at the moment if I'm dealing with Mr. Putin. But nevertheless, Wagner is here and we have to deal with it as well. On the regional plans, I am trying. The regional plans are over 3,000 pages long and also written in NATO speak, which probably makes them the equivalent of 12,000 pages long when you try and decipher them. It is very important that we try and both make our commitments that meet those plans and also support others if they don't have that capability, because the strength of NATO will be, can it carry its political determination into a military plan that makes a difference and deters, because that's what we're really about, deterring Russia or any other aggressor. So there is a few more weeks and months to go, but I'm absolutely wading my way through the 3,000 pages to see where in the action plan, and after this statement I'm off to the Army on Salisbury Plain to discuss exactly that.
Selwood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could I very much welcome this statement? I've just returned recently from Ukraine. There's massive appreciation for what Britain has been doing and continues to do, not just from the government with its lethal aid, but also from the British people with the humanitarian support that's been gifted as well. There's huge anticipation about the counterattack that's likely to take place, but also a message, which I hope the Secretary would agree, that it may require a second, third or fourth counteroffensive to take place. This isn't going to end simply when the Ukrainians decide to push forward, and we should expect Russia to go ugly, to use unconventional systems in response. On Storm Shadow, could I welcome this? Yet again, Britain stepping forward. Are the Americans going to match with ATACMS? And could he spell out the fact that there's still a request for jets to be gifted as well? And finally, Trump last night refused to say that he wanted Ukraine to win. This is a material factor because he could necessarily win the United States election next year, and this might be what Putin is banking on. Thank you.
Yes, my right honourable friend's characterisation of the counteroffensives is correct. I don't think there is a single, one last thrush and everything's over by thrust by Christmas. I think this is a matter of Ukraine, quite rightly, finding and exploiting, as any good general would, weaknesses or indeed opportunities. So I think we should always manage our expectations that it is not all over by Christmas. And when you have a Russian army that doesn't mind sacrificing hundreds of thousands of its own people, you're up against not such rational leadership that would recognise, as anyone else would do, that the game is up already. When you lose 10,000 armoured vehicles and over 250,000 dead or wounded of your own soldiers, most people would have recognised the game is up. So that is one of the big challenges. Look, there are other, obviously, weapon systems that Ukraine asked for, and the ATACMS is a well-documented capability. We're pretty confident that the Storm Shadow will plug some of that gap and definitely deliver the deeper range that HIMARS used to achieve when it was at 80 kilometres, but the Russians, after suffering significant losses to HIMARS, obviously worked out and moved beyond range rings. So we think the Storm Shadow will absolutely help the Ukrainians make that difference as well. And on the US President, the US President today is President Biden. I have a good relationship with him, so does the government as well. They have stood firm, $87 billion worth of donations. They put their money where their mouth is. They have huge amounts of effort gone into their support. I lived in America for a few years, or my parents did. I know that the decent and good people of America would recognise that their rights are just as important as the people's rights of Ukraine, and whoever comes next as the president, their constitution upholds rights. I think that is what will unite them, and I'm confident that whoever comes next will continue to support the battle to uphold human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for a very detailed statement and advance sight of it, and to assure him that the SNP condemn and will continue to condemn Putin's unprovoked invasion of a peaceful democratic neighbour in the strongest possible terms. Can I join with the Labour front bench in asking for, once again, the UK Government to formally prescribe the Wagner Group as a terrorist organisation? And could the Secretary of State take back to his colleagues in other departments that we would like to see a plan to support Ukrainian refugees to seek damages against the Wagner Group in the UK courts? And could he also, given that he mentioned Iran, I would also add that the government should be considering prescribing as a terrorist organisation the IRGC as well. Could the Secretary of State tell us that President Zelensky has said that Ukraine is constrained by delays in the delivery of armoured vehicles, and what action plan is the government, along with its allies, making sure that those armoured vehicles are delivered to assist in those efforts? And finally, could the Secretary of State comment on reports that India imports of Russian oil has risen tenfold in 2022, and what does the government plan to do alongside allies to ensure that oil products originating from Russia do not reap record profits?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I'm grateful for the SNP support on this. I think we all recognise what Ukraine is fighting for, and it appeals to all of our decency and how we must stand up for it. His suggestion of Wagner Group in the financial penalty or the suing in the courts is an interesting one, and it does slightly remind from my previous days as security minister, prescription is an important tool, but it rarely unlocks any more than a sort of brand, a labelling of something. The thing that will go for Wagner will have a bigger impact will be suing in the courts, I suspect, given mercenaries, if they don't get paid, don't hang around, and seeking damages through our amazing court system, whether that is in Scotland or London, is where it's world-renowned for being fair and respected, has a long tentacle. So I listened to his suggestion. While I can't advise the victims of Wagner Group, I certainly think hitting Wagner in the wallet will certainly probably have a stronger method, even though prescription, I hear, is also wanted. And I also listened to the IRGC call. Iran is absolutely supplying Russia with drones. It can't hide it, it can't pretend it. It is supplying Russia with drones. And of course, Russia in return is funding the Iranian and the IRGC to make those drones and that industry, and that poses a wider threat to the region, whether that is to Yemen, Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, Iraq, where we see Iranian drones being used already, and there's no good shall come of it, shall we say, on that. As far as delays go, one of the assistance we do, we have people in Poland and Slovakia and Romania helping coordinate delivery and helping the logistics of it. We stand by to help any other nation do that, and I'm very happy at our next meeting of colleagues, either at NATO defence ministers or other, to find out who's having a difficulty, and we stand by ready to help. One of the things not written about what we do in Ukraine, some of the great work we've done, is in things like logistics, flying aircraft to pick up people's donations and bringing them back to the hubs. All of those people are heroes to me. They're members of the RAF, will be flying their airplanes. We do it often, in a sense, not secretly, just the media don't seem to want to write about it, but I know about it, and I think it's a really good work by doing it. So we'll keep the momentum, we'll keep the supplies coming in, but I think we should all recognise, and if any of you has visited the Ukrainian training, there's a lot of hardship still to come.
Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I welcome the delivery of Storm Shadow because we must do all we can to even the odds for our Ukrainian friends who faced a well-armed terrorist state. However, I am concerned that at this point, while we have not managed to suffocate Putin's war machine, yes, we need to deliver military aid, but we also need to make sure that we suffocate the finances that allow Putin to continue to wage this war. So can I urge my right honourable friend to lobby the Chancellor to establish an economic Rammstein of G7 Treasury ministers or allied nations who can come together and make sure that economically we are doing what is needed to stand up the phenomenal war effort being led by my right honourable friend and all of our allies around Europe.
I'm grateful to my friend. I think it's a good idea, and I'll definitely pass that on to the Chancellor. I mean, they have done already work through the G7 with the oil cap, but she's absolutely right that Russia needs funding. It needs to sell its oil and gas. I mean, currently there are reports that it sells it at huge discounts to China and India in order to get it through there. And I also know that both the Foreign Office and the Treasury work tirelessly to close any loopholes that's brought to their attention, whether that's brought to the attention by members or anyone else, the law enforcement agencies. I think Russia has shown itself at being adept in these loopholes. But we do see in the Russian industrial base, it is now struggling in some of its rearming of its equipment because so much of its subsystems seem to have come from the West that now it's finding it hard, definitely, to resupply itself.
John Speller.
Mr. Speaker, the announcement about new munitions to Ukraine is very welcome, but we also need reassurance that his department will be able to restock. So can he tell us what they're doing to ramp up and sustain production capacity, including supply chains, not only to support Ukraine until the end of this conflict, but also to ensure restocking for our own armed forces?
The right honourable gentleman has asked, and consistently asks, and he is right that we have to keep restocking ourselves. Some of the restocking has started in the NLAWs. You remember the very first gifting that has started a few months ago. Also the areas of the low and high velocity anti-aircraft missiles. On 155s, I'm hoping to be able to inform the House in June that we would have placed a long and enduring contract in the UK to replace our 155 shells, which of course one of this conflict exposes is that you need those type of fires available. So it is important. It's important. The Treasury gave me in the autumn 560 million for some of that refurbishment, but also other funding at the latest budget, which I will of course make sure is spent in keeping our forces refurbished.
Francois.
Thank you, sir. We have led Western Europe in supplying kit to the Ukrainians, ably administered by MOD equipment, defence equipment and support, it should be noted, but we haven't yet sent jets. Despite the fact we've got a squadron of Tranche 1 Typhoons sitting in a hangar, and despite the fact that President Zelensky very publicly called in Westminster Hall recently for us to do that. Secretary of State knows from his own experience that when this long-awaited counterattack begins, those Ukrainian brigades must have local air superiority over the battlefield in order to succeed, and what is left of the Ukrainian Air Force is far too small to do it on their own. So can I ask him specifically, what are we doing, A, to send jets, and B, what are we doing to encourage other Western allies to send them MiG-29s, F-16s or even A-10s, because it would be a tragedy, literally, if the counter-offensive ran out of momentum because it lacked air support.
My right honourable friend is right to talk about how you may maintain momentum and needing air support, because of course, while the Russian army has been very, very badly decimated, its air force, a significant part of its air force remains in a good condition, and therefore it is vital that that air attack potential is minimised. On particular jets, we offered, as you know, to the Ukrainians training on Typhoons. I recently received a letter turning that off as a request and asking us for support on the F-16, which of course we don't hold. However, I would encourage anybody to gift F-16s to help the Ukrainians, and in the meantime, we already use some of our funding and support to buy spares for the likes of the MiGs and everything else if that is required, because the other challenge this year is going to be sustainability. A lot of equipment has been gifted, huge numbers of Russian tanks have been captured. If we can refurbish and sustain them, then of course that's the best way and quickest way for Ukraine to continue its fight. So we need to keep its air force flying, but however on the F-16 I'm very happy to encourage any of my colleagues to donate them, and if they do, we'll happily move them.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, I'm very grateful both for advance sight of the statement and for its substance. 2 days ago, the Washington Post reported that the UK, quote, now appears poised to send Kyiv the long-range missiles that the Biden administration has long denied it. What is the United States government's position on the UK's decision to supply this deep strike capability?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. The issue I take with the Wall Street Journal is the US have not denied Ukraine longer range. They put in the HIMARS and indeed some other Western systems. The difference is the ATACMS, which is a different type of munition. It's not a sort of deep strike. The Storm Shadow has the capacity to hit below ground. It's like it can go into a bunker type thing, and an ATACMS is more of an area weapon system. So it's a different weapon system. You know, the Americans have been clear on its donations or not at the moment considering that donations. As far as the use or the donation or gifting of Storm Shadow, the United States have been incredibly supportive on the United Kingdom's decision to do so.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for his very sobering statement? The sheer scale of atrocities against civilians is horrific. It's heartbreaking that over 23,000 civilians have been wounded or killed. Last month, UNICEF told us that Now the number of children who've been killed is over 500, and we must not forget the thousands of children who have been kidnapped by the Russian child catchers. Given the attacks on medical facilities and the level of casualties, can my right honourable friend update us on what medical support the UK has been giving to Ukraine?
Yes, my right honourable friend sitting next to me, the Minister for Defence, Personnel and Veterans, and himself a naval surgeon, has been incredibly proactive in coordinating and supporting that. Met a number of times with the Ukrainian Surgeon General and will again soon. We have provided training and equipment, certainly in the healthcare for the medical, including rehabilitation, but also alongside in the Department of Health has been able to support, and I'm very happy to write to the Honourable Lady with the details of the sort of pure civilian medical help and assistance we have given, but that often is around things like generators, ambulances and other medical supplies.
Barker.
Deputy Speaker, the Defence Secretary himself has said that the Conservatives have hollowed out and underfunded our armed forces. So why is the Defence Secretary still pushing ahead with further cuts to the British Army by 10,000 troops and £2 billion real terms cuts in day-to-day MOD spending, which means less money for forces' pay, recruitment and families?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it would be good if the Honourable Lady actually quoted me correctly. I didn't say the Conservatives, I said successive governments, including her own, for the last 30 years have hollowed out the armed forces, and that's why we need to rectify it. It's why we got £24 billion recently and an extra £5 billion at the last election, not last budget, not only to refurbish, but also to modernise our armed forces. Get the quote right next. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, Storm Shadow is a potent weapon, so I cautiously welcome the announcement today on the basis of what the Secretary of State has reported to the House. I'm also reassured by the undertaking that Storm Shadow will only be used to prosecute targets inside Ukraine. Why? Because NATO's aim has to be to eject Russia from Ukraine, not to wage war against Russia. My point is this: can I also ask him, please, in the same way that Challenger 2 preempted the deployment of Abrams and Leopard 2, could we assume in this particular case that the deployment of Storm Shadow might preempt other medium and long-range weapons being deployed from other NATO nations? And also, could he specifically answer, please, what it will take for F-16s to be deployed?
Well, first of all, my honourable friend, there are other nations with similar but not exactly the same type of weapon system, and I have seen already our next bidding round for the international fund will include deep strike and long-range fires that we will procure through this international fund, which includes Sweden and Norway and the Netherlands, etc. on that fund. So there is more to come from both the markets and depending on what gifting. What we would say is that the assessment of the gifting we've so far planning to give of Storm Shadow, and Mr. Deputy Speaker, I won't say for operational reasons the exact number, is currently enough to satisfy the Ukrainian demand for that capability. We'll keep that under review to make sure we can make the difference.
Shannon.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome the Secretary of State's statement today, and can also commend him for his very, very strong and determined leadership. He reflects what we all want him to do, and he does it very well. Thank him for that. President Zelensky has stated this very morning that Ukraine needs much more time to prepare to launch the highly anticipated counter-offensive against Russia, as the military still needs the Western aid that has been promised. And that the Secretary of State has indicated some of those things that are happening to prevent further loss of life. What immediate steps will the Foreign Office take to deliver the much-needed announced vehicles to assist Ukraine push back Russia as they intensify their attacks in Donetsk Oblast?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I think none of us should underestimate the political weight on the shoulders of the President of Ukraine. It's easy for us here in our safety of London and behind an alliance of 30 in NATO to forget that he is going to have to make a decision at some stage of this year to send men and women of their armed forces across minefields towards machine gun posts to take back their sovereign territory. And I think it is There will be no easy way to predict when they'll do that, and he has to balance that with also an economy deliberately destroyed by Russia that he is also going to have to balance. So I wish them well in that. We will continue to support them to the end, in my view. It's what I believe and we stand for. We will keep supporting them. What I can say is, if he delays because he's waiting for the equipment, I would understand that fully. We'll do everything we can to make sure everything gifted is in the right place at the right time. So when he makes that decision, those men and women have the best chance of survival.
Mandel.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I draw attention to my entry in the Register of Members' interests. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and announcement, and he set out a list of atrocities which surely shames Putin and Russia. I've seen for myself in Ukraine how evilly and deviously landmines and other booby traps are contrived in order to cause the maximum casualty and danger to civilians. So will my right honourable friend confirm that the UK Government will continue to support the day-to-day work of the Halo Trust and the Mine Action Group in the removal of these mines, because they are the imminent threat on a day-to-day basis to so many civilians?
Yes, the Halo Trust is an amazing organisation. I think first founded under the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and that's where its pedigree comes from. I met recently some people who had been working in the Halo Trust in Ukraine. It's ongoing now, but long after this is over, I know they will be there, and the government will do everything it can to support them, whether that's through the Ministry of Defence or the Foreign Office and other departments.
Margaret Ferrier.
Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. Before 2022, the Ukrainian army uniform had not been adapted for women's bodies. Today, women form about 23% of the army in Ukraine, and roughly 7,000 are fighting on the front line. Does the Minister agree that the bravery of these women should be recognised? And what support has the Government provided Ukraine to ensure that female soldiers have the equipment that they need?
The Honourable Lady makes a really important point, and indeed when my honourable friend, the member for Wrexham, did her report about women in the armed forces, one of the main recommendations for our armed forces was making sure we're buying equipment for women and not just a sort of for all in that sense, and we have started to do that, and as such our industry has become some of the industry leaders in that area, and as a result some of the work and gifting to Ukraine reflects exactly that, to make sure they get something specific for them that makes it easier to live in those trenches and survive. Thanks for prompting me, Mr Deputy Speaker, because when I go to Salter Plain in about 25 minutes, I shall make sure we get a catch-up with the training of Ukraine and find out if they're still getting those uniforms.
Speaker, and can I thank my honourable friend for the update he's given us today and for all of the work he's doing, which is absolutely tremendous. I spent a very short time, just a few days in Ukraine earlier this year, and saw the devastation coming from the illegal invasion. He touched on Operation Interflex. Is he able to say any more about how that work is progressing? Thank you.
Yes, I took the First Lady of Ukraine to Interflex last week. We have nearly 700 foreign troops helping from Australia, New Zealand, most of the Scandinavians and the Dutch, alongside about 750 British troops. We have trained 9,000 plus last year and are on course to do 20,000 this year. We've now expanded at the request of Ukrainians, not just to do basic training, but we're now training non-commissioned officers and indeed have just started last week platoon commanders courses. So we're starting in the development of the low-level leadership that you need to start to rebuilding your armed forces. We expect to continue to get requests. We've had another request to expand the training. We are absolutely in the middle of it. I'll be having a conversation about that this afternoon, and I hope to have more to announce to the House later.
I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for Defence for his statement today and for responding to questions for over 3/4 of an hour.